The Compliance Perspectives podcast is sponsored by Case IQ, a global provider of whistleblowing case management and compliance solutions. Learn more at caseiq.com. Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives podcast. I'm Adam Turtletaub from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us today from New York is Rachel Gerstein. Rachel was most recently Managing Vice President, Global Ethics and Compliance Council at Gartner, where she led the Compliance and Ethics program. Today, we're going to be talking about trade sanctions. Rachel, can you give us on a very basic level a description of what trade sanctions are?
Sure, Adam. So nice to be here with you. Trade sanctions, honestly, at a basic level, are laws and regulations. So they're put in place by governments and they're intended to prevent and punish, engaging with very specifically with countries, with organizations, and with individuals. And the reason that these laws and regulations are put in place is because of threats, usually to national or international security, or because of human rights violations. And, the sanctions themselves can be very significant, can cause real economic disruption for the targets and keep them out of key financial markets. So as an example, the US has countrywide sanctions against Iran, Cuba, Syria, and North Korea. And sanctions can be not only countrywide, but also can focus on a particular sector like banking.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And we've certainly been seeing a lot more of them lately. Now, what are the keys to an effective sanctions compliance program?
So to have an effective sanctions compliance program, I think first you really need to understand, who enforces sanctions compliance. So here in the US, and the US is the biggest enforcer of sanctions. It doesn't mean we're the only country that has sanctions. Most countries do. But in the US, sanctions compliance is enforced by the Department of Treasury. And the group at the Department of Treasury that enforces it is known as OFAC, or the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And OFAC has published a framework which really makes it easier to understand how to have an effective sanctions compliance program. And it's very similar to how the DOJ publishes its guidance to effective ethics and compliance programs. So in order to have an effective sanctions compliance program, there are 5 key pillars, and those are management commitment, risk assessment, internal controls, testing and monitoring, and training. And basically, compliance officers really need to ensure that all of those 5 pillars are effective, or that there are clear compliance mechanisms in all 5 of those areas for sanctions compliance. And if not, you may find yourself sitting across, unfortunately, from a regulator.
And people very much don't want to be sitting at that table. Now, often, if not most of the time, trade sanctions, export controls tends to be separate from existing compliance programs. How can we best build bridges in those situations? For example, are there existing tools in the compliance chest that are useful for sanctions compliance?
Yeah, I certainly think so. And in my experience, generally trade sanctions is a great fit within the compliance program. Even if you just think about those 5 pillars that I just mentioned, there's so much overlap. So if a traditional compliance program maybe started off as focused on anti-corruption compliance, you're doing a lot of the same work. So you have your management commitment or your tone at the top that you need to set. So that's something that's, a great fit. You also have risk assessment, which is obviously you're doing a risk assessment on corruption. You need to do a risk assessment on trade sanctions. But another great fit is really your third-party risk management. So when you're looking at your third parties, it's very clear that you need to also be conducting screening. So if you're, doing some screening for anti-corruption, you want to be doing some screening for trade sanctions and ensuring that your suppliers and your customers are not on any criminal watch lists. So that's probably something that you're already doing, looking for financial crimes issues in that same context. So screening and transaction monitoring really help companies comply with sanctions and evaluate their third parties, and focusing also on the ownership structure of those third parties to really continuously monitor who you're working with.
The overlap is very clear, yes. So now, are there cases where the differences are so great that other tools are necessary?
I think so. I mean, clearly what you're looking for in corruption is not the exact same thing you're looking for with sanctions. So with sanctions, you need to know if your third parties are on a specific sanctions list. And often, in my experience, companies hire third parties who compile various lists of sanctions, and they also do the work to consistently monitor and update those lists. And then what companies do is they use those third parties and they run their suppliers, customers, and other relevant third parties through those compiled lists to ensure that the third parties they're working with are not sanctioned. And for example, one of those third parties may even be the banks that your company is working with. Many of those third parties that compile the lists are using AI. So, of course, Adam, we can't have a conversation without mentioning AI. And those third parties are using AI as they compile their sanctions list to ensure that sanctions are picked up even quicker. So, as I mentioned before, with sanctions, you also need to understand the ownership structure of those third parties. OFAC has something called the 50% rule, so that if an entity is owned more than 50% by a sanctioned entity, that entity is also sanctioned. I mean, also your policies are going to be different, right? You need an anti-corruption policy, but you also need a trade sanctions policy. You're going to want your internal audit team to do different audits, or perhaps they can do the audit together, an overall financial crime audit. But there's another tool, which is geo-blocking, and companies are starting to use geo-blocking to monitor IP addresses to really ensure that entities and individuals who are coming onto their systems are not from sanctioned countries. So I think there's a lot of overlap, as we've said, but I think there are, different tools that companies need to use when it comes to trade sanctions. And trade sanctions is a no-fault violation. So a lack of controls leading to an issue where you're accepting money from a sanctioned entity or individual, is a no-fault violation. So that's not going to, be an excuse. Oh, we didn't have controls, or oh, we didn't know. That's not how OFAC is going to see that.
Good warning there. Now, sanctions risks sometimes come up in strange ways. What should compliance teams be on the lookout for?
In my experience, sanctions always come up in strange ways. It's really never so obvious. I think, this is really where training comes into play because, for example, people who live in Eastern Europe see Cuba or Havana as a vacation destination, and they may not be aware that, there are very strict US sanctions on doing business with Cuba. And if they work for a US company, they need to comply with those sanctions. Or, people just might not be aware generally, of sanctions. They may not think anything of receiving a payment from a bank in Iran. And I think that's where, one of the pillars is training. But I think of training in this context as being very targeted. And really, the people who are in charge of monies going in and out of the company really need to have a targeted understanding of the sanctions that apply to the company. I think also this is where reputational risk often will come up when you're doing your screening to find out if your entities are on sanctions lists. So, adverse media screens, these companies that provide sanctioned watch list compilation, often when they give you your sanctions results, will often be giving adverse media results. And those can be really important to identify companies who are not necessarily sanctioned, but maybe ones that companies want to avoid, for fear of reputational damage. And in addition to sanctions, companies who ship goods, who actually have goods that are sitting, on docks, really need to understand import and export controls, which are often a part of sanctions compliance programs.
Well, Rachel, thank you for pointing out all the things to be on the lookout for. And just to end with a somewhat humorous sanction story, years ago, I went on a trip to Cuba. It was a fully licensed, approved one, done through UCLA with full educational content and met all the requirements. And one of the people on the trip asked about playing golf at Verdadero Beach, which is where all those resorts that Europeans go to are. And the guide smiled and said, as far as Cuba's concerned, you can play golf, but your OFAC says no, no, no. So even the guides in Cuba were aware of the sanctions requirements. Well, Rachel, thank you again for taking the time to talk to us today. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I'm Adam Turtletaub from SCCE and HCCA. I hope we're able to expand your compliance perspective.